Hi, we're back with Small Print. I'm Bronwyn Williams, and today my guest is Lars Doucet. As always on the show, we ask our guests to introduce themselves. So Lars, how would you introduce yourself? What are you doing? Where are you in the world, and who are you?
Geez, yeah. How would I describe myself? Well, I guess the main reason, I have much of a recent identity is this book I wrote called Land is a Big Deal. And, whoops, I knocked over my microphone. I suppose that makes me an author. Before that, my background is I have a degree in architecture originally. And instead of going into architecture, I went into video games for a while. And then after that, I got into consulting, and then I got really into kind of back to my roots in the built environment in land economy and the economic philosophy of Georgism. And then I wrote this book about it. And then recently I have transitioned to a new career change, which is I'm getting into mass appraisal research because I'm very interested in calculating the value of land. So I'm part of a startup that does that now, among other things.
So you're part of quite a small center of a Venn diagram in between architecture and economics, which is a more interesting way of looking at economics than pure maths economics, I think, for a lot of people that aren't familiar with the topic. But anyway, I came across you when I think it was one of the articles you wrote about land value in games. At the time, I was involved with a gaming startup where I was also looking at different ways to solve economic problems to stop games getting uneconomically balanced through play. And it was very interesting. And that article was about essentially that problem, the problem of monopoly around certain assets, whether it's in a gaming world or metaverse economy or real world economy, and how that makes the playing of the game quite unfun as soon as it becomes unfair. And how, in fact, as soon as you have any sort of monopoly over anything that is necessary to build wealth, you are going to run into that problem one way or another. Like the way we approached solving it was quite different to the way that you did. But I think that you looked at the problem, as you said, coming at it from Georgism and how those ideas are having a recurrence all over the place at the moment. I'm very much here for it, although I'm generally described as being quite a libertarian. I think I deviate from my particular tribe, and I'm not actually adopted by them because I question the idea of property rights altogether. I think, quite frankly, they're not a right to start with, and they're not necessarily a good idea either, which is quite a heretical thing to say. Maybe we can start off with by you describing, for people that aren't familiar with Georgism, what it is. I know that one of the first pieces you wrote on your blog, I think it is The Game of Rent, that's.com, that's the site there, was around Georgism, as was described in the book Progress and Poverty, which is quite an old book that's having, as I said, a bit of a moment at the moment.
Yeah, so I mean, the basic economic philosophy of Georgism is, I guess the best way to describe it is describe what it's not. It's not, one of the classic two doctrines that's just occupied all the brain space for the last 100 years, which is classic doctrinaire capitalism or classic doctrinaire socialism. Right. And I classify those philosophies as essentially being allied with one of the three factors of production. Capitalism is obviously allied with capital, right? It thinks that we need to focus on encouraging, the formation of capital. And then socialism is very much focused with the treatment of laborers. So it's very much aligned with labor. But Georgism is very much not so much aligned with, but concerned about the question of land, because it thinks land is kind of this central aspect of the economy. And what do we mean by land? Well, we don't just mean literal land, although we certainly mean that. We also mean natural resources. We essentially mean anything that humans don't produce, because humans can produce labor by going out and just doing it, or they can produce more capital by going out and making more things, saving up more things. But the one thing we can't produce more of is any more land, in the sense that we can't produce in more locations. And natural resources, they pre-exist us, essentially. And George's insight is basically that if we don't find out how to share the non-produced assets that nobody produced, they will get hoarded, they will get gate-kept, and it will create these kind of monopolistic factors in the economy, kind of monopolistic shadows in the economy. I call them shadows because people don't realize that they're really there. And other frameworks kind of treat them as forms of capital, but they're really not capital at all. They don't behave like capital does. And that's kind of George's entire insight, is we need to learn how to share the earth if we want to be able to do all the things capitalism promises. and that socialism is trying to, save us from, right? If we want to have an equitable economy, we need to find out how to share these things nobody made, basically.
Yeah, I think the big challenges with capitalism are around scarcity and who gets to own what. I certainly see the problems having two distinct problems. The one is the problem of how we deal with real scarcity, and that is things like land, or one of the big debates here in South Africa where I live is things like spectrum rights, is who gets to set the monopoly prices over how much you pay for data, which is such an essential part of doing business and connectivity at the moment. So real scarcity allocation, of which markets are generally quite a good way to deal with those things. I think Georgism comes at it and says perhaps taxation is a necessary sort of wedge within those marketplaces, and we can get into it why it's such a neat solution, because it doesn't lead to dead weight losses and those sorts of things. But the other challenge with capitalism is the challenge of unnatural or artificial scarcity, which is something where it becomes quite interesting to experiment with, particularly in like gaming worlds and all the rest of it, where all scarcity is artificial scarcity. And I think that from my perspective, using capitalism to allocate artificial scarcity is an absolute crime. There's like no justification for it whatsoever. So I would probably go even further in the Georgism, sort of my view on what Georgism can solve is it's not just even around questions of rights of land. I think it's a way of looking at all monopolies. So for me, like instead of saying money is the root of all evil, I generally tend to say monopoly is, right? Because what is a monopoly? A monopoly is using public resources to defend private rights, whether you're looking at intellectual property or physical property rights, whatever it is. That's essentially what a monopoly is, in the sense of where it becomes a problem, where it becomes something that's unfair that needs to be dealt with. So sort of framing it in that perspective, let's go back to how the whole sort of Henry George way of looking at the world approaches how we can solve this through taxing essentially land itself, because land, as you said, shouldn't be seen as being a productivity in and of itself. You have to add people to it. And as such, that natural endowment should be for the benefits of everyone. So maybe in your own words, I know you've written quite extensively about it, how what a land value tax is and why it could perhaps be a solution to a lot of those very unfair monopolies that are giving us all sorts of things like debates across capitalism and socialism and inequality and all of those things.
Right. Well, as I'm sure you can attest, living in South Africa, struggle over land is the oldest struggle in human history, right? It's the root cause behind the struggle in Ukraine and Russia right now. Russia wants the land, Ukraine has it, and, so bombs fly. And, the land value tax is kind of often explained as like being what Georgism is all about. And it is certainly George's chief policy prescription, so it's worth digging into it. But as you kind of intimated, like Georgism proper is about everything that has the kind of characteristics of land. And so the land value tax is basically this insight that it's like, okay, how have we tried to share the land in the past, right? There's the kind of socialist or, outright communist approach, which is that, the state will just own all the land, and then the state will also dictate what gets done with it. That's the central planning approach, right? The very extreme communitarian approach. The capitalist approach is like, well, we just have fee simple land ownership. This comes from the English system of land ownership. And fee simple means you pay a price, you own it. So you not only control what happens with the land, but it's like your private property. You can give it to your heirs, you can sell it, you can rent it, you can do whatever you want, right? And then there's a bunch of different kinds of land ownership in the middle. One thing that is commonly done throughout history is whenever, land ownership gets too monopolized and the peasants get uppity, is you have a revolution and then you have land reform. And land reform tends to be, okay, we basically violently or otherwise seize all the land and distribute it up to the peasants. Right, redistribute it, right?
A new landed gentry class, right?
Right. And so the thing is, yeah, and so the thing is, it's like in the best cases, this can work in the short term. The problem is you eventually wind up right back where you started. You just have a new set of landed gentry that you didn't have before. So the issue with the land value tax is George's insight is instead of doing any of those things, he thought that the value of land should be common property, but the control of it should be private. And his reason for that is that central planning doesn't work. Having the central government decide what should be built where is generally a bad idea.
Yeah, critics of socialism have a point.
Right. But at the same time, if people are allowed to capture all the value of land, that's value they didn't create. And it creates these horrible incentives. It creates incentives to underbuild, for one, and it also creates incentives to basically sponge off of the hard work of others. And this is because George understands the economy as fully three-factor. Capitalism and socialism, although they'll acknowledge the role of land, will treat it as if it's capital. And so they have a two-factor model of the economy, capital and labor. And you see that in all their discussions. Even if they say land is the third factor, they'll treat it as if it's just capital. And George says there's land, labor, and capital. And what does that mean? So he says that there's this economic theory called Ricardo's law of rent. And I won't go into all the details, but basically it cashes out to mean that as the productivity of an area increases, the land values will increase. And all you have to do is have been alive for the past 20 years to observe this happening. You know, San Francisco is a really good example, Silicon Valley. If you're making less than $100,000 as a family of four, you're under the poverty line. And that's not a joke. It's just true because it's all going to rent. You know, it's all going to housing costs. And the other thing about housing costs and rent is because all the service workers who need to work in the city, they need to be able to afford to live in this city, and they're getting squeezed too. So the price of their services goes up. This is what's called the housing theory of everything, is that as rent starts to squeeze people, not only does your rent go up, but all your other costs that are downstream of other people's rent go up too. And where does all that money go? Well, it goes to the landowners. And what are the landowners producing? Well, they're not producing the land. The land can't be produced. You know, maybe they're producing some amount of housing, but mostly they're blocking housing. Mostly they're trying to, you know, we could build more housing on the same amount of land, and that would reduce competition for land because more people could fit on the same amount of land. But generally speaking, landowners have this NIMBY, not in my backyard tendency to block the construction of land because they know it's one of the few levers that could, you know, kind of weaken
Insiders, outsiders, like unions and labor, right? So it's like your landlord is basically the insider in the land equation.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And that's kind of the deal. And so the land value tax basically proposes that if we recapture the value of the land, then essentially land stops becoming this speculative investment asset that's worth holding on to as a point of leverage over other people. And that then we can take that revenue and redistribute it to the community, and the community is who created that value. Because if I improve my property, it will improve the value of all the surrounding properties and a little bit the community in general. So like if you imagine an empty lot in the middle of Times Square, well, what did the owner of that empty lot produce? Like a parking lot in the middle of Houston. What did they produce? Nothing. The city of Houston, the city of, you know, all of Manhattan produced that value collectively. And those are the people who should receive the value of those land rents is the Georgist position.
Yeah, so of course, one of the major criticisms of it, and I know it's also something you've spent quite a lot of time trying to justify is, and what you mentioned at the beginning, what you're actually working on at the moment is, that's fantastic, but how do you separate the value of the land from the value of the contribution the landowner has made to it, which is where these conversations usually get derailed by people on both sides of the political spectrum, or all sides, you know, but it's generally both in most of these conversations, in that if you can't quantify what is a natural endowment that is really should be owned by all of mankind and what is the work of a particular individual or entity's hands, then this all becomes that's marvelous in theory, but how does this play out in practice? I know you've done quite a lot of work really digging into the numbers of how that can, even if it has not already been done, and it should at least be something that we can pursue.
Right. Well, it has been done in many places. It's mostly just been understudied. You know, there's a lot of these historical cases of where it's been tried before. But kind of the creation of the invention of the automobile kind of derailed the early Georgist experiments because it opened up a new frontier of cheap land in America. And then we had the whole Cold War and 2 world wars and a depression that kind of just derailed all of economic thought for about a good century. But there have been some interesting examples that are worth looking into. So we have Vancouver, ironically, you know, Vancouver, which is now one of the worst examples of the housing crisis, a long time ago used to be Georgist. It used to collect all of its revenue from land rents, from land taxes. And we also know that we have places like Houston in the 1910s had very close to a single tax. That one was very short-lived. It was only a couple of years before the Texas Supreme Court shut them down. But J.J. Pastoriza had a land value tax in Houston. And what's interesting about Vancouver's early experiment in Houston's is that neither of them had the modern benefit of computers, which we have now. And they used a very interesting calculation method called the Summers system, which was created by a man named Summers. And this was something that the early Georgists used. This is not the system that most people advocate using today, but it's interesting that apparently, it was sufficient to work back, it's over 100 years ago. And the method they used was quite radical. They basically just this was basically modeled for an urban environment where everything's a lot more compact than it is now. And they basically just did a series of public polls to kind of just solicit public input about what the land value of every street was. Seems kind of weird. It wouldn't be the first thing I would think today, but then once they got all that public polling and consensus in, they then would go through and use this kind of mechanistic method to use that data to be like, okay, this is so many front feet on this location, and just parcel out the city's land values. And they did Georgia's land value taxations based on that, what we would now consider a fairly crude, but, very, very interesting method. That's the Summers system. That's what's historically been done 100 years ago. And it was apparently good enough to work back then. I haven't seen it tried in modern times. In modern times, what people mostly suggest, there's a couple of methods. The kind of classic one most economists jump to is what's called the cost approach. And this is kind of the standard of municipal property tax appraisal right now. I'm somewhat of a critic of it. I think we can do much better than that. The cost approach essentially says, okay, we can observe the value of sales for places. We can see all these sales, but we don't know, you don't buy buildings and land separately, you build them together. So what we can do is we have this system called the cost approach, is we try to estimate the construction cost of the building and then apply depreciation. And that method, and then the residual, the results that's left, once you subtract that construction cost, you get, the land value, presumably. I basically believe that this method severely undervalues the value of land, but in a sense that is perhaps a check in its favor, because what you really want to do is make sure you're not overtaxing the land. So if you want a modest land value tax, the cost approach is fine. It's very unlikely that you would overtax the land if you were using the cost approach, because it tends to, chronically undervalue land. Then there's some methods that are more advanced. There's regression analysis, right? Hedonic statistical methods. So the example I tend to give is that if you have, if you can, economists do this all the time when they're trying to tease out the individual contribution of something. If you have a sandwich shop which sells a variety of sandwiches, just cheese sandwiches, breads and cheeses, and different sizes of bread, different kinds of cheese, and you have enough transactions and you just observe them, I can tell you if there's a surge in the price of bread, and which bread, through regression analysis. And so the same thing can be done with land. And there's other more advanced methods like paired sales analysis and time indexing. Basically, the long and the short of that is that you have 15 identical properties, but in different locations of the city that sold at around the same time. Probably the difference in those prices is due to land, and you get a better signal as you get more data. With time indexing, if you have the same property that's been kept up at about the same level of condition, but has sold for vastly different prices, like, I'll tell you this, my money pit house that is constantly degrading is going up in value. That is not because of improvements I've made. That's because the location is in more demand. So that's land value that's increasing. That's not, I have not put, $50,000 of work into this house that has not been immediately eaten up by degradation, right? And so those are all methods that you can put together and kind of fit together and check each other to make sure that you're getting closer to the land value. I think people who raise the calculation problem aren't engaging with the latest cutting edge research. And I don't know, I intend to prove them wrong, and we'll see if they accept the methods I'm working with.
You've certainly done the work. I mean, there's plenty of charts and tables that people can go and pour through and criticize and add their own information to. And I think more people are looking at this, the better. It's definitely something that, like, actually doing these things rather than just talking about them theoretically is, I think, really the next step for enacting some of it, or pushing for policies that do lead towards some change, because inequality is one of the big problems. And unfortunately, the way we're taxing at the moment is not solving those problems. We tax all the wrong things. We tax goods instead of taxing bads. We tax people instead of taxing problems. We tax time instead of taxing things. We get it exactly backwards because taxes are usually distortionary. Like any economist will tell you that. And in fact, any human being knows this. You know that it's unmotivating to have a large chunk of your salary go off at the end of the month, and to know that somebody that's inherited their wealth that's not actually contributing to the economy on a day-to-day basis is not paying that tax. That's fundamentally unfair. And I know this. I live in the world's most unequal country by many measures. And we look at income inequality and we complain about that a lot because it's easy to measure, right? And that's what government's like, right? It's easy to measure, it's easy to manipulate, it's easy to tax. That's not where the real inequality lies. The real inequality lies in wealth, which, as I think we've got at least some way to articulating, is largely tied up with monopolies and largely to do with inherited wealth regarding land. To some degree or another. Now, the question that people would then have, that perhaps haven't looked at the issue as deeply as you have, is that all taxes are distortionary. You know, they either benefit someone to the detriment of someone else, they add deadweight losses, at least the way that they are presented. But a land tax is slightly different. It works in a different way. And it's one of the rare ways that we can actually have taxes that don't create deadweight losses in market equilibrium. So in other words, it's compatible with capitalism too. So can you describe why that is, or why land tax is different, behaves differently to different taxes when it comes to being an incentive, disincentive for behavior?
Yeah, so it's interesting. So it depends on who you ask, because among Georgists, so either say that land value tax is neutral in the sense of being non-distortionary, or super neutral in that the only things it distorts are bad things you want to distort in that direction anyway. Yeah. So depending how pedantic we want to get, that's basically the idea. But the basic insight is that if you tax something, you get less of it, right? So if you tax, cigarettes or tobacco, you get less of those. And so those are what's, so taxes on bads are what are called Pigouvian taxes. Sometimes sin taxes, yeah, or sin taxes, right? And so the idea is that if you tax, nuclear waste dumped in lakes or whatever, anything you don't want, or carbon emissions, right? It's like, yeah, you'll distort those things, but you want to distort those things because you want people to do less of that. You're using it not just to collect revenue, but to change behavior. Those are called Pigouvian taxes, and Georgians generally favor them. With land taxes, the idea is that because the supply of land is fixed, because land is non-fungible, because land is non-produced, if you tax it, it's the one thing you don't get any less of. And that's not entirely true. There's other things you can tax and not get less of, which is anything that's non-produced, like radio spectrum, orbital real estate.
Really scarce natural resources again.
Right. Things that like are non-fungible, non-produced. Then you sometimes have things that are they're not in fixed supply, like you can reduce them, but you can't increase them, like genuine antiques, right? Like there's no time machine factory that's producing more things that are 100 years old. Like there's only less of those over time as they get destroyed, right? And so there's some like edge case arguments about like how taxation affects those. But generally speaking, like land is one of the few things you can't make any more of. And so taxing it doesn't have a distortionary effect. But taxing buildings, which is what we currently do with property taxes. Current property taxes are a mixture of a land value tax and a building tax. They tax both things, and the portion that falls on land is good and the portion that falls on buildings is bad, right? And so the Georgist position is very often stated that it's like, let's just reform existing property taxes. And this makes more sense in places that already have very high property taxes, like my home state of Texas, for instance. You could easily turn Texas into a Georgia state if you were to pass what I call a universal building exemption. We would then shift to having a modestly high land value tax just by giving everyone a tax break on the buildings they have, and then but collect the same dollar amount of taxes. But yeah, so basically because you can't produce more land and because its location is fixed, this also has the effect that the landlord cannot pass on a land value tax to tenants. This is another objection of Georgism, and it's something that has been proven empirically. There's just been quite a lot of studies, over a dozen. I've written about this extensively, that the theory predicts that it wouldn't happen. They wouldn't be able to pass the tax on to their tenants. But then empirics bear that out too. And so that's another way that land is special, is because of its non-produced, inelastic supply that you have that effect.
That's really, really interesting. The other thing that comes on together with that, of course, is the single tax question, which is distinct from the let's tax land, let's have a land tax, let's value the property and let's tax it because it's not a distortionary, or at least a negative distortionary tax that's going to create more scarcity rather than creating more abundance for more people. So the question around single taxes, that also comes up quite a lot with Georgism and around some of the other economic ideas that come out of that sort of school of thought. What is the thinking around a single tax? The moment we have multiple tax codes for every different thing, and as anyone that knows anything about human beings knows, the more rules you have, the more loopholes there are, the more incentives there are to play arbitrage against the various different tax codes, whether it's as simple as the differences between a business tax and a personal income tax, all the rest of it. So from a Georgist perspective, what is the logic behind a single tax? In other words, replacing all these other myriad taxes that we have that create different distortions across the market with a single land value tax, perhaps supplemented by some of those other sort of Pigovian taxes that you mentioned, but that's for different reasons. That's not actually for income producing reasons. It's more for sort of behavior control reasons. Right. So I think we can separate those two things and talk about the idea of funding society, this social contract that we have, with a single tax funded by land. What is the logic behind that?
Yeah, so we'll talk about the historical case, then we'll talk about what a modern single tax would look like. So in the historical case, it was kind of a slam dunk case, in my opinion, because especially in the United States, when George was first advocating this, we did not have an income tax. You know, we were funded like mostly by tariffs, which are super distortionary. It's so weird to mix trade policy with income policy. It's insane. So you absolutely could have had a single tax in George's time, because you could have just replaced these tiny tariffs with the land value tax. In modern times, the critique is that the single tax cannot raise enough. But the logic for it is essentially that we have all these other taxes. We should only use those if a land value tax cannot raise enough, because that is, in Milton Friedman's words, the least bad tax, right? Because the income tax is a tax on labor. So we get less labor, and we're also taxing all of our workers. And, you know, people are like, well, we should labor income taxes are so, governments love them because they're so easy to do, you know, but the problem is it's this huge drag on productivity, and it also doesn't really target super wealthy people. Super wealthy people don't pay income tax. They're smarter than that, you know? And so then there's a question of, it's like, okay, well, we better tax capital, right? That's where all the wealthy people have got their stuff. So like capital.
You got balance sheets. You can play with those things if you can hire the good lawyers and accountants, right? You can always buy another car and not pay tax.
Right. Yeah, capital gains. And then they find ways to like make sure that their gains are unrealized and stuff like that. But even if you do hit the capital gains and capital taxes and investment taxes, well, now you get less investment, you know, and isn't that something we want? Do we want more investment and innovation in our economy, right? And so they're like, right. And so they're like, well, let's tax businesses. Well, what can businesses really do with their money? They can either spend it on their workers or they can reinvest it. But like, a business is not really going around buying a gold yacht, even if Jeff Bezos is, you know? And so, and a lot of those business taxes will end up falling on small businesses because the Googles of the world can figure out how to serve up the double Irish with a dust sandwich to avoid all their taxes. And then you're like, well, let's tax wealth. You know, that's what we really want to do. Jeff Bezos has a gold yacht. Let's tax him. Well, the problem with the wealth taxes is Jeff Bezos. Yeah, and Jeff Bezos and the gold yacht will just go away. They'll leave your country, or they'll find some more ways to avoid the taxes and just hide where the money is. And so the beauty of a land value tax is that the land can't hide, right? It doesn't even matter if you don't know who owns it, right? Because it's like, hey, 423 Apple Street, here's your land value tax bill. I don't care who you are. I don't care how many shell corporations you're hiding in the Bahamas. Make sure the tax bill comes in the mail, because I know exactly where this parcel is, right? And it can't leave my country, you know, it's part of my country. So that's kind of the beauty of it from a policy perspective. In terms of the single tax approach, it was just, you know, we don't want all the bad effects of these other taxes, right? And then the criticism is just that it can't raise enough money under a modern economy. And that's where I decided to be like, okay, let's measure, because this was my frustration. People make all these arguments and then they hinge on a calculation question that no one has calculated. So I went and I did the math, and I figured that we could get pretty close, and we could get all the way there depending on a couple assumptions. I don't know if they're true or not. It would take further research. So On the federal level, we could get pretty close to a single tax. We could certainly make major offsets to existing taxes. We could pay for any one of American Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. So that's the second category, is healthcare, or defense, all by itself with the lowest estimate of what land value tax could raise. On the highest end, we could...
Just to interrupt you, sorry, there's an important point there. That's based on market-related prices of land itself, having done that calculation.
Right,
not manipulating the numbers, because other ways to look at this, and I think other economists have presented it in the case of you could look at the other way around. You don't even need to justify that a land value tax can fit the bill if it's a single tax. You could vote on a budget and then just split it proportionally across all your landowners, right?
Right, you could certainly do that.
There's backwards ways to do these things too, and that's self-funding. That's even without even going down the one monetary theory route. Yeah,
and that's how you go. And the municipal level is that they pick a budget first, and then they set a millage rate based on that.
Yeah,
right. Right. Exactly. And so on the high end, you could pay for all the non-discretionary stuff. Now you would still have some left over, and then you have like state and local government funding, and how are they going to get funded, right? And so for a modern single tax to work, either all the budgets would have to go down, or you would have to be able to count on these things called dynamic effects being true. So there's this theory called at-core, all taxes come out of rent, that basically says that every tax we have on income and stuff like that basically causes land values to go down by a bit because tenants have less money to be able to pay. And that if you reduce those taxes, basically the extra tax break everyone gets just gets soaked up into land values anyway. And so a land value tax would just tautologically always work. I'm not sure if that's true. Maybe it's, maybe some taxes come out of rent. I need to see the empirical case. But where I would go instead of necessarily relying on that is, well, natural resources. And I think I'm a Norwegian citizen in addition to being an American. My mom's an immigrant. And in Norway, they've been extremely successful with natural resource taxes. And so America is abundant in natural resources, so are most other countries. And the Norwegian model really shows us that Georgist management of natural resources, which we can get, I won't monologue on this, we can get into it in a future question if you want to go into it, is a good way to supplement, and not only to raise income, but also to ensure that industry is productive and avoids the resource curse. And so a modern single tax, in my mind, would be probably not literally just land value tax, but you would include other Georgist taxes before you try anything else. So you would have taxes on radio spectrum, you would have taxes on orbital real estate, you would have taxes on natural resources like oil and minerals. And if you really want to get crazy, we could start talking about taxes on things like domain names and other kind of scarce resources that we've created for ourselves, and maybe even intellectual property, before I would go for an income tax.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, like you don't want to tax things that you want more of, and I don't think there's many countries that want their populations to have less income and less employment. It seems crazy. This is the way that we fund most of our budgets, and we can talk all we like about making our tax codes more progressive by like taxing the top earners at a higher rate. We really are just shuttling those deck chairs on the Titanic. We're not solving any real problem, although it all sounds great and progressive. It doesn't solve the core problem of inequality. The really rich still just get richer and richer. Whereas Georgism goes right to the core of that issue. It attacks the wealth question rather than the income question. And it's very progressive. I mean, again, if you're interested, you can go over to Lars's websites and have a look there. Again, you've got a lot of the charts that show just how much of that land, that real scarce resource, is held by the very marginal percentages in our communities. It's much healthier debate to have too. It's very hard to argue with that data, whereas things like inheritance taxes feel inherently unfair, whether you're a middle class person or a poorer person or a wealthier person. Those taxes are personal. You're still taxing people. You're still effectively taxing productivity at the end of the day. Whereas there's other ways to deal with this that just feel a lot fairer. And there's something very, very fair about a single tax. It's very unavoidable. As you say, everyone's got to pay. It's there. The land's there. However you carve it up. There were two other things that I wanted to get into while we have time. The one question was something that was missing from your sort of interrogation of the Georgist question, which is come up in other circles that I'm quite familiar with around where these ideas around Georgism are quite popular too. And that would be the question around using Harburger taxes instead of using actual calculations on land to get to a real price, which is of course the real way to do it. The way you've done it is the hard way, which is generally in these things going to get you a fairer price. But at the same time, there are compelling arguments around those sorts of ideas that have been also old ideas, almost as old as Georgism, that have been repopularized, coming out of a lot of the sort of crypto communities thinking around how to divvy up various different digital and real resources. Do you have any thoughts on those sorts of topics? And like Glenn Wheel's obviously done that, delved into those subjects quite a lot, or is it something that's not beyond the scope of your work?
So Harburger taxes, this is basically the idea that, the historical example is the Danish king needed to tax shipments. And so the idea was, I'll just let them tell me what they think the shipment is worth, and then I'll tax them on that basis. But I have the right to buy it at that price. So you're like, oh, my shipment's only worth $1. Then the king's like, well, I'd buy that for $1. And they're like, okay, it's worth $1 billion. And the king's like, you ready to pay taxes on $1 billion? And you're like, okay, it's worth $23,748. You know what I mean? You pick like it's a great method for
sorts itself out. It's sort of a self-governing system.
Yes. So it's a great method for price discovery. There's a couple problems with Harburger taxes in my views for land valuation. One is it doesn't help you split land versus property. It is basically a good method for wealth assessment. And so, my understanding of Weil's pitch for Harburger taxes, and I might be wrong about this, please correct me if I am, is that he's essentially pitching it as a wealth tax. And he means that, like, he's in support of wealth taxes. And so that's kind of my critique, is that it's like, okay, well, if you want to do self-assessment for land and you could find some way to do that, then, I would support that. But I'm not exactly looking to tax wealth. I'm looking to tax land. And so you would still need to figure out how to split the land values. You could use it perhaps to get the total values, which are an important ingredient of working out the land values. There is the issue of also the fact that it creates a forced sale, which can be kind of politically fraught. Right. But I've seen some variations to Harburger taxes that kind of like sort that out and kind of like make it sprout some hairs and warts that kind of deal with that, which are interesting. What's interesting to me is that the Summers system kind of sort of rhymes with Harburger taxation in a very distant way. The Summers system relied very much on this community input, which involved a lot of the people who lived on those streets. And there's a whole book that's been written about it. I need to read more about it because it seems like the kind of thing that probably wouldn't work, except for the annoying historical fact that clearly it did to a decent degree. So I need to learn more about how that played out in real life. But like self-assessment, I think is an interesting and clever way to get around these things. The other related mechanism that Georgists often recommend is the victory auction.
Yeah.
And this is done in a situation where the government already owns a lot of land. And the idea is, instead of, if the government already owns a lot of land, it can lease that land out, right? And the victory auction is basically a method where instead of optimizing for getting the highest price, as in a typical auction, it optimizes for getting the most honest price. Like, what are you actually willing to pay? It's like a sealed auction sort of deal. Anyway.
Although economics also says that generally it's the second highest bid is probably the fairest auction there in terms of minimizing dead weight loss. So the second highest bid should take the prize if you want to get the fairest price with the least.
That is exactly how a victory auction works.
So, and also on that sort of point, looking into that, again, like from my perspective, probably the Harburger taxes solution is better for things that don't have the land plus development value conundrum woven into it. So they make a lot of sense for auctioning off new mineral finds or new oil fields or spectrum rights, those sorts of things, where the separation question isn't really the problem, but we're still talking about actual scarce resources that need to be distributed that someone needs to manage because the state's not going to do a good job. I say this as I'm waiting for my power to go off for my daily 4 hours of load shedding. So monopoly is not great in state hands. If you want examples, come to us. We will show you around, and we will see why these compromise solutions, these ones that take the best of both worlds rather than the worst of both worlds, are definitely things worth exploring. I did want to go back to your whole Norwegian question, because they had some interesting points that they did with trying to avoid the resource curse, which is something that most of the African continent has not managed to avoid. So maybe you could just elaborate on what the resource curse is and how Norway took a very different approach that's been very useful. It also ties together ideas of things like universal basic income, which are very popular at the moment. I have my own questions around that, but we can leave that conversation. But it draws a lot of these theories together in a very practical case study that shows it can be done.
Yeah, so the resource curse, what is it? It's basically this paradox where you have a nation that's very rich in natural resources, and it turns out over time that having a lot of natural resources can actually make it more likely that you stay poor and underdeveloped and have bad human rights records, right? So why is that? And the answer is that when you have a lot of natural resources, it can become easy for the government to become reliant on a resource extraction economy. Instead of having, when you don't have natural resources, well, basically only your people are your resource, and it's better if they're educated and happy and productive, but if you can just extract resources all day, you can, oppress or even enslave your people or just ignore them, right? And just send men with guns after them to keep them quiet while you just ship all the diamonds or the gold or the oil or whatever abroad and sell it. And it doesn't even matter if you're getting the best price for it, because you're getting a good enough price for you. And so Norway's situation is interesting because, I always like to point out that Norway is now known as one of the richest petrostates in the world, especially relative to how large its population is. But the irony is that it wasn't us, tall, blonde, blue-eyed Norwegians who set up this petroleum industry. I mean, certainly we had some hand in it, but a lot of the credit needs to go to an Iraqi immigrant by the name of Farouk al-Qasim. What basically happened is that he married a Norwegian woman. He was a petroleum geologist, and their son got sick, so they moved back to Norway for medical care. So, hint, hint, it's good to have a good medical system if you want serendipity to happen to you. He was looking for a job, and
that's the catch.
Yeah. And he said, I'm looking for a job. Does anyone need a petroleum geologist? And Norway had just discovered an enormous amount of oil, and they had no idea what to do with it. And they said, can you please help us? And he said, great, I can help you. And also, you're about to get struck with the resource curse. I've seen this happen before. And it can happen to Europeans too. There's a reason we call it Dutch disease, right? And so what he basically set up was like, okay, so here is what I recommend based on what I saw happen in Iraq and I would like to avoid in Norway. You should set up an adversarial oil regulator, as well as a national oil company. So you shouldn't just do this naive nationalization. The problem with naive nationalization, the government just takes over management of the natural resource, is you get underinvestment and you get a flight of competence, right? You do actually need those awful capitalists because they're the ones who know how to develop the resource. The problem is they're greedy and lazy. So you need to get their competence without letting them get greedy and lazy by rent seeking off of the extraction of the resource.
Incentivize them, but keep them on a leash.
Right, exactly. You make them to actually work for a living, right? So you align their incentives. And also, this is really important if you're a country like Norway, because in America, we're like, well, those are American billionaires, so it's okay. But in Norway, it's like, those are foreign billionaires, right? Who are going to suck all the resources out of the country. Yeah. So the principle is that, start with the principle. The Norwegian people own the oil. They own the oil. Everyone, including the government and foreign companies, is working for them. So we are hiring you to produce Norwegian oil. So when you produce it, we will say, thank you very much. And we will take an enormous percentage of the extracted resources value as a severance tax because it's our stuff, right?
We'll pay you for your labor, basically. Yeah. We're not going to give you.
We will pay you generously for your labor, for your investment, for your R&D, because the complaint on severance taxes is always like, boo-hoo, I'm a big giant corporation. I need to take these huge capital risks. And that's true. It's very risky. So what if we just eliminate the risk?
For my risk, which is probably one of the most vacuous claims of capitalism.
Right.
Justify windfall profits, looking at the banking sector, which we haven't touched on today, but
right.
Property rights that we need to look at.
Right. And the problem is that whenever some company complains like that, they assume that the only proper compensation for risk is eternal monopoly rights. Without eternal monopoly rights of the full extraction value of the resource, I will never be incentivized to produce. And Norway just called that bluff. They're like, what if we just paid you to produce? You don't want to produce? Hey, look at all these other competitors that are just dying to produce right now.
Again, incidentally, this is the same argument that I come up against a lot when it comes to my criticisms of IP rights and copyright. I'm like, but then who will make drugs if we don't have monopoly rights over insulin for the rest of, human existence? Well, guess what? There are different ways to fund these things. Same lessons. It's very parallel. Guys, listen to this.
Yeah. And so these researchers from Norway have written about how Norway has done this multiple times with different natural resources. We did with hydropower in the early 20th century, and that was actually set up by Norwegian Georgists. And we recently passed some laws to do the same kind of system to manage aquaculture locations. But let me give you an example on IP and medicine, because I have narcolepsy. And narcolepsy medication in the United States, there's one drug that treats it, cataplectic narcolepsy, very, very well. But nobody invented this drug. It's a naturally occurring chemical, and it also happens to be a highly illegal street drug that's often abused. So it seems like we need to be careful. We need to manage this, right? And so these Norwegian researchers have written in other cases that when you manage a resource like that, whether it's a drug or a resource or something, you will create a monopoly around it. Right? Because the American government in its wisdom has decided, oh, because this is an illegal street drug and it's abused, but it's this miracle drug for narcoleptics. We need to create a monopoly and give that to one corporation so that everything is safe, right? And guess what? That corporation now gets to charge monopoly rents to all the narcoleptics in America. Now, in actuality, they just rip off your insurance company and they find some way to get it to you. But it's always like if
then
they
your insurance company rips you off, and again, it's an income tax.
And if I ever get crosswise with them, I have no recourse and I'm out my medication, right? Like I'm kind of nervous even bringing it up on this podcast, but whatever, I gotta say the truth, right? And so the thing is, every time you create a monopoly through regulation, you create a monopoly rent. And if you don't tax that monopoly rent, it gets captured by rent seekers who then get greedy.
Tax the rent away. That's the essence of Georgism. Tax the unproductive profit or the unearned profits portion of.
Right. And the rents are always collected. It's just a question of who. And if you don't collect them, then you are essentially submitting your entire economy to private taxation. And so the deal with copyrights and IP is it shouldn't be a question of it's like, does Mickey Mouse really need to last for 100 years? Is that sufficient to produce Mickey Mouse? Like maybe 20 years is fine, maybe 10, maybe 50. I don't care, but probably not 100, And then the same with like monopoly rents on patents.
It's fine again. Then that's another perfect case there where Harburger taxes are perfect. If you want to keep your monopoly over your creation, you can keep paying, because that's the problem. You pay once to file a patent that you might never use. You can sit on it. Like the patent trolls do, never produce it, creating artificial scarcity against amazing ideas. And you only have to pay once for that, not just lifetime, like that sort of infinite, recurring ability to harvest profits off these things. As far as I'm concerned, all IP and copyrights should be on some sort of an ongoing payment basis, like rent. You should rent your own IP, right? Like you've created it, but you can keep on paying for the monopoly rights on it.
Right, especially because where does that because where does that monopoly right come from? It comes from the government's monopoly on force. That if someone else tries to use John Carmack's algorithm that he created, so if John Carmack tries to use an algorithm that John Carmack wrote, he'll get sued by the people who made Sound Blaster. This was the case for like 20 years. It was ridiculous. He had to put a worse algorithm into the open source release of, I think it was Doom 3. Because some sound card company had patented an algorithm that he had written, which is insane.
Or patented colors, as the debate was last year, right? Yeah. Like we got to stop that. We got to stop paying using public funds to support private monopoly rights. I think it's a pretty clear that would be my sort of slogan for any
just to slow down and to slow down and halt innovation, right? Like what are we getting for our money?
Like more expensive drugs.
Yeah, that's for sure.
But anyway, Norway seems to have got a very interesting solution to this problem that I think should be explored outside of Norway and for more applications. It's really not just a resource question here. It cuts across all things to do with property rights. I think it's a rich vein of theory and policy that can be explored for good. And very few policies are sort of win-win, not win-lose. I think there are not a lot of losers in the Norway story.
Right. Yeah. The losers are foreign companies that would like to rent seek off of Norwegian oil. Right. And so the other thing is that it actually, oil, right? We're talking about that. Do we really want to be extracting it? What about the environment? And that's another question, which is why Norway needs to have a plan for when the oil runs out. But also, like Norway's extraction itself is a lot less environmentally damaging. Because it causes people not to drill a million holes so that they can just sit on them forever, right? Norway gets more oil out of every hole. And so whether or not we should be drilling oil in the first place, if you're going to do it, this is the best way to do it. But another example of, I think, where this would be a really uncontroversial thing to do is Nestle. They really love to rent seek off of people's water. And they did not create the water, but they come and they capture it and then they sell it back to you. And what they're selling it back to you for does not represent the value out of them bottling it, right? They should pay the people for the extraction of the people's water, and then they get to charge for their value add.
Not a
Georgism
one-off
at its
thing. This is an ongoing pay the
Right.
rents back to the people.
Right. The Georgist philosophy is you get to receive the results of your labor and your capital, but not for gatekeeping land and natural resources. And so, like, I think companies like Nestle should have to pay an ongoing severance tax on every gallon of water they extract. And then they can make money just like the rest of us do by working for a living.
I like that. It's so simple. Who could argue with that logic? But I have taken up a lot of your time. Lars, where can people get hold of you? Where can they get your book? Where's your book? I live in South Africa again. I could not get hold of a physical copy postal service.
Okay.
Interesting.
So
another monopoly we can solve.
Yeah, so you can get my book at landisbigdeal.com. We are now published through an international distributor, so hopefully you should be able to get one now. But if not, there's an ebook and an audiobook available on that website, which will arrive through the magic of the internet. I have that same book is also published on gameofrent.com in a series of articles that became the book. They're less well edited on the blog, but they're free. And then there's I'm on Twitter at Larsius Prime, and my startup is called ValueBase. We're valuebase.co. So if you need some property mass appraised, that's kind of what we're in the business of.
Very interesting. Thank you so much for spending time with us today. Look forward to catching up with you in the future.
Thank you very much, Bronwyn.
If you enjoyed this conversation, please subscribe to our YouTube channel and rate us on all your preferred podcast platforms. If you'd like to find out more about what we're doing, please join our Substack community via the link in the comments below. And as always, we'd love to hear your suggestions for future guests and conversation topics.